A small-town badge can make a small-minded man feel like a god. Officer Bradley Lawson thought he was just asserting dominance when he tried to kick a quiet black couple out of a roadside diner on a rainy Tuesday night. He didn't care that they were paying customers. He just didn't like the look of them. But Bradley was about to make the biggest and last mistake of his career. Because those weren't ordinary patrons. They were federal undercover detectives, and he had just stepped into their trap. The neon sign above Rusty's All-American Diner flickered with a persistent, annoying buzz, casting a sickly red glow over the rain-slicked asphalt of Route 9. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the diner was a familiar sanctuary for the weary, the insomniacs, and the shadows of the city. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old fry grease, burnt filter coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of cheap tobacco. Sitting in a cramped corner booth near the back, nursing cups of coffee that tasted like battery acid, were Detective Andre Miller and Detective Sarah Jenkins. To anyone else in the diner, they were just a tired, working-class couple trying to escape the torrential downpour. Andre wore a faded, grease-stained mechanic's jacket over a thermal shirt, his posture slumped, eyes heavy. Sarah had her hair pulled back into a messy bun, dressed in a worn denim jacket and an oversized hoodie. They looked like two people who had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift at the nearby auto plant. In reality, they were two of the most highly decorated investigators in the Tri-State Organized Crime Task Force. "Mic check, Command." "Do you read?" Andre murmured, not moving his lips, taking a slow sip from his chipped ceramic mug. The microscopic transmitter embedded in the collar of his jacket picked up the barely audible whisper. A sharp crackle sounded in the flesh-toned earpiece buried deep in his right ear canal. "We read you loud and clear, Andre," came the voice of Captain Robert Harrison, situated in a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away in a desolate strip mall lot. "Visuals are holding steady. We have cameras 3 and 4 covering the front entrance and the parking lot. Your target is still 10 minutes out." "Copy that," Andre replied softly, setting the mug down. He met Sarah's eyes across the table. Sarah didn't flinch. She was absently stirring a packet of artificial sweetener into her tea, her eyes scanning the diner through the reflection of the rain-streaked window beside them. 10 minutes, she whispered, her voice steady and clinical. "If Dominic doesn't show this time, we lose the window. The warrant for the warehouse expires at midnight tomorrow." "He'll show," Andre said, though his stomach tightened. They had been building this case for 8 grueling months. The target was Dominic the Ghost Corelli, a mid-level supplier for a massive illegal arms and narcotics syndicate that had been flooding the interstate with ghost guns and fentanyl. Corelli was notoriously paranoid. He never used phones, never stayed in one place for more than an hour, and only conducted his handoffs in public, seemingly random locations. Tonight, Rusty's Diner was the drop spot. Corelli was supposed to meet an unknown buyer, hand off a ledger that contained the locations of 3 major stash houses, and collect a duffel bag of cash. If Andre and Sarah could intercept the ledger, they could dismantle the entire syndicate from the ground up. It was a multi-million-dollar operation, and everything hinged on this single, tense night in a run-down diner. The diner was mostly empty. A couple of long-haul truckers sat at the counter, chewing on cold toast. A teenager sweeping the floor in the back seemed more focused on his headphones than the dirt. Betty, the 60-year-old waitress with a severe nicotine habit and a name tag pinned crookedly to her apron, was wiping down the counter for the 4th time. "Keep your heart rate down," Sarah advised, noticing the subtle tapping of Andre's fingers on his knee. "You're projecting. Just want this done, Sarah," Andre breathed, shifting in the cracked vinyl booth. 8 months of living out of motel rooms and eating gas station food. I want Corelli in handcuffs and I want a real bed. Soon. she promised, offering a tight, professional smile. "Just play the part. We're David and Michelle Clark, just a couple waiting out the storm." Suddenly, the headlights of a vehicle swept across the front windows of the diner, illuminating the dusty blinds. Andre and Sarah both tensed, their training instantly kicking in. Was it Corelli? The vehicle pulled into a spot right by the front door, the engine rumbling with a heavy, aggressive idle. It wasn't Corelli's sleek black sedan. It was a local police cruiser. The bold white letters of the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department gleamed under the flickering neon lights. Andre let out a slow, controlled breath. "Local PD, just a patrol stop." "Command sees him." Harrison's voice buzzed in their ears. "Officer Bradley Lawson. He's on his regular patrol route. Just ignore him. Keep your eyes on the door for Corelli." The heavy glass door of the diner swung open, letting in a gust of cold, wet wind and the unmistakable, heavy-booted swagger of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Officer Bradley Lawson stepped into the diner, taking a moment to forcefully stomp the mud off his boots onto the welcome mat. He was a thick-necked, red-faced man in his late 40s, his uniform stretched tight across a barrel chest and a gut that suggested years of free donuts and sedentary authority. His utility belt creaked loudly with every step, heavy with a sidearm, a taser, and an expandable baton. Lawson didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it. He removed his rain-slicked hat, running a hand through his thinning blonde hair, and surveyed the diner with the cold, arrogant gaze of a warden inspecting his cell block. "Evening, Betty," Lawson boomed, his voice unnaturally loud for the quiet diner. "Evening, Brad," Betty replied, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She quickly poured a fresh cup of coffee and set it on the counter. "The usual?" "Yeah, throw a slice of that cherry pie on a plate, would you? And make it the big slice." Lawson didn't offer to pay. He never did. He unclipped his radio, set it on the counter, and took a slow sip of the coffee, his eyes darting around the room. He dismissed the truckers immediately. He ignored the teenager. Then his gaze landed on the back corner booth, on Andre and Sarah. Andre felt the heat of the stare immediately. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. He kept his eyes on his coffee, projecting an aura of bored exhaustion, playing the role of David Clark to perfection. Beside him, Sarah was looking at her phone, seemingly engrossed in a mobile game. Lawson's eyes narrowed. In his deeply flawed, prejudiced worldview, a black couple sitting quietly in a diner late at night didn't look right. Not in his town. Not on his shift. He didn't see two tired workers. He saw a target. He saw an opportunity to exercise the petty power that defined his miserable existence. Lawson picked up his coffee cup and, abandoning the slice of pie Betty had just set down, began a slow, deliberate march toward the back of the diner. The heavy thud, thud, thud of his boots on the linoleum floor echoed in the quiet room. "Trouble?" Sarah whispered, her lips barely moving. "Stand down," Andre whispered back instantly. "Don't engage unless forced. Corelli is 5 minutes away. We cannot blow our cover over a local traffic cop." Lawson arrived at their booth, stopping just inches from the edge of their table. He stood too close, deliberately invading their personal space, his hand resting casually on the butt of his flashlight. He loomed over them, casting a dark shadow over their cold coffees. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared, chewing on a piece of gum with an open mouth, his eyes darting between Andre and Sarah with undisguised contempt. Andre slowly looked up, adopting a look of mild, weary confusion. "Can I help you, officer?" Lawson smirked, a cruel, asymmetrical lifting of his upper lip. Just doing a little neighborhood watch, pal. You folks aren't from around here, are you? Just passing through, Andre said, keeping his voice polite, steady, and deferential. Car's been running hot. Pulled over to let the engine cool down and wait out the rain. Passing through, Lawson repeated, drawing out the syllables as if the words were a lie he found amusing. Where you headed? Up to Portland, Sarah chimed in, her tone light but exhausted. Visiting my sister. Lawson shifted his gaze to Sora, his eyes raking over her in a way that made Andre's jaw clench. The sheer disrespect rolling off the patrolman was palpable. Portland, Lawson scoffed. Long drive, especially this time of night. What are you doing in Oak Ridge? Like my husband said, just stopping for some coffee, Sarah replied, keeping a tight, polite smile plastered on her face. Is there a problem, officer? I didn't say there was a problem, Lawson snapped back, his tone instantly hardening. The polite facade vanished, replaced by the aggressive posturing of a bully who felt his authority was being questioned. But we've had a string of break-ins around here lately. Out-of-towners looking for easy scores, and sitting all the way in the back, in the dark. Look suspicious. Command to Team 1. Do not engage. Captain Harrison's voice crackled urgently in their ears. Corelli's vehicle has been spotted 2 miles out. 3 minutes. De-escalate and get rid of the uniform. Andre forced a deep breath, swallowing the intense, burning desire to pull his federal badge, stand up, and verbally eviscerate the racist cop standing over him. But the mission came first. Millions of dollars, countless lives saved from the fentanyl trade. He couldn't throw it away for a bruised ego. We don't want any trouble, officer, Andre said, intentionally softening his posture, making himself look smaller. We've paid for our drinks. We'll be out of your hair as soon as the rain lets up. I think you should be out of my hair right now, Lawson said, leaning over the table, his breath smelling of stale coffee and mint gum. This is a respectable establishment, not a loitering spot for transients. The pause before the word transients was loaded with 1,000 unspoken slurs. Officer, it's pouring rain outside, Sarah pointed out, gesturing to the window. We're paying customers. Betty has our tab. Betty doesn't run this town. I do, Lawson growled, slamming his heavy hand flat onto their table. The coffee mugs rattled violently. The sharp noise caused the truckers at the counter to turn around, their eyes wide. Betty froze near the pie display. The diner had gone dead silent. The only sound was the drumming of the rain against the glass and the buzzing neon sign. The tension in the booth was suffocating. Andre's mind was racing. If they stood up and left, they would miss the drop. Corelli would walk in, see the empty booth, get spooked, and vanish into the wind. 8 months of work, completely destroyed. If they stayed and fought back, Lawson would escalate. He would try to arrest them for disorderly conduct or resisting. It would cause a scene. Flashing lights, backup called, sirens. Corelli would see the cruisers from a mile away and abort the mission. They were trapped between a multi-agency federal sting and a bigoted local cop looking for a power trip. Let me see some ID, Lawson demanded, snapping his fingers impatiently. Both of you, right now. Officer, under what suspicion? Sarah asked, her legal training flaring up despite her best efforts to suppress it. We haven't committed a crime. State law requires reasonable articulable suspicion for an ID demand. Lawson's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The fact that a black woman in a hoodie was quoting the law to him was a direct assault on his fragile ego. His hand moved from his flashlight to hover dangerously close to his service weapon. Listen to me very carefully, sweetheart, Lawson hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing gravel. I am the law in this town. You are loitering, acting suspicious, and now you're refusing a lawful order. You produce identification right now, or I'm dragging both of you out of this booth by your hair and locking you up for obstruction. Do we have an understanding? Andre, Sarah, give him the aliases. Harrison barked over the wire, the panic evident in the captain's voice. Corelli is 1 mile out. 1 mile. Give him the fake IDs, apologize, do whatever it takes to make him walk away. Andre reached a calming hand across the table, resting it over Sarah's. It was a signal. I've got this. Play the game. No problem, officer. No problem at all, Andre said, deliberately making his voice sound shaky, playing the intimidated citizen. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly, okay? Lawson took a half step back, his hand resting firmly on his gun belt now. Nice and slow, boy. Don't try anything stupid. The word hung in the air like a foul stench. Boy. Andre's eyes went cold for a fraction of a second, a terrifying glimpse of the highly trained federal operative beneath the mechanic's jacket, before he quickly masked it back to weary fear. He reached into his back pocket and retrieved a worn leather wallet. He pulled out a perfectly forged state driver's license. David Clark, 34, Portland, Oregon. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a matching ID. Michelle Clark. Lawson snatched the plastic cards from their hands. He held them up to the dim light, squinting at the text, his thumb rubbing roughly over the holograms to see if they were cheap fakes. He looked from the ID to Andre, then back to the ID. David Clark, Lawson sneered. Portland, you're a long way from home, David. Like we said, officer, just passing through. Lawson tossed the IDs onto the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. They skittered across the formica, stopping near Sarah's tea. I don't like you, Lawson stated plainly, dropping the pretense of a police investigation entirely. He leaned in close again. I don't like your attitude, I don't like your tone, and I sure as hell don't want your kind bringing down the property value of my town, even for one night. Andre stared at the table, forcing himself to swallow the rage. 30 seconds, Harrison whispered in the earpiece. Corelli's car just pulled into the parking lot. He's outside. Do not blow this. Get Lawson out of there. Outside the window, through the heavy sheets of rain, the headlights of a sleek, black Mercedes sedan swept across the parking lot, coming to a stop at the far end, away from the cruiser. Corelli was here. The drop was happening. Look, Andre said, his voice tight. We showed you our ID. We're drinking our coffee. We will leave in exactly 10 minutes. Just let us finish. No, Lawson said, a triumphant, cruel smile spreading across his face. He had won. He had pushed them into a corner, and now he was going to exercise his power. You're leaving right now. Get up. Both of you. I'm escorting you to your vehicle, and I'm following you until you cross the county line. Andre and Sarah locked eyes. If they got up and walked out with the cop, Corelli would see them leave. The meeting would be a bust. The buyer inside the diner, who they still hadn't identified, would abort. The $1 million bust would vanish into thin air. Officer, Sarah said, her voice dropping the fearful act, taking on a sharper, firmer edge. We are not leaving this booth. We have broken no laws. We are waiting for someone. Lawson's eyes widened in genuine shock. No one talked back to him in Oak Ridge. Ever. Excuse me, Lawson roared, his voice booming through the diner. Betty dropped a spoon behind the counter. It clattered loudly against the floor tiles. The teenagers shrank into their seats. You heard my wife, Andre said, his voice finally losing its forced tremor. It was calm, deep, and resonated with absolute authority. He didn't break eye contact with Lawson. We are finishing our coffee. Walk away, officer. Lawson's face contorted with absolute fury. The veins in his thick neck bulged. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt with a sharp metallic clack. "That's it. You're both under arrest for trespassing and resisting," Lawson snarled, stepping forward and reaching aggressively for Andre's shoulder. "Stand the hell up. Andre, do not break cover. Corelli is walking toward the door," Captain Harrison yelled through the earpiece. Through the front window, Andre could see the silhouette of a man in a heavy trench coat, holding an umbrella, stepping out of the black Mercedes. Lawson grabbed the fabric of Andre's jacket, attempting to haul him out of the booth by force. The sting was dying. The operation was seconds away from completely imploding because of one racist patrolman's power trip. Andre's muscles coiled. His federal badge was in his inner left pocket. His sidearm was holstered at his right hip. He had to make a choice, and he had less than 3 seconds to make it. Lawson's meaty hand gripped the faded fabric of Andre's mechanic's jacket, his knuckles white with the exertion of his own misplaced rage. He yanked backward, fully expecting the smaller man to tumble out of the vinyl booth and onto the dirty linoleum, completely at his mercy. It was a tactic Lawson had used 100 times on teenagers, drunks, and folks who didn't have the power or the melanin to fight back in Oak Ridge County. But Andre Miller didn't budge. Instead of being pulled off balance, Andre's center of gravity dropped instantly. His left hand shot up, locking like a vice around Lawson's thick wrist. The sheer, immovable density of the federal agent sent a shock wave of surprise straight up the patrolman's arm. "I said, let go," Andre said. The tremor was gone. The weary traveler act had evaporated in a millisecond. His voice was a flat, terrifying baritone that cut through the diner's ambient noise like a scalpel. For the first time that night, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed Lawson's flushed face. He tried to yank his arm back, but Andre's grip was like industrial steel. "Assaulting an officer!" Lawson spat, his voice pitching higher in panic. He reached awkwardly for his pepper spray with his free hand. Through the rain-streaked window, Dominic the Ghost Corelli pushed open the heavy glass door of Rusty's diner. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, tinny sound that violently contrasted with the impending carnage. Corelli stepped inside, shaking the water from his expensive Italian trench coat. He was a sharp-featured man with predatory eyes, clutching a black leather briefcase tight against his ribs. He took exactly 3 steps into the diner before he saw the uniform. Corelli froze. His eyes darted from Lawson's broad back to Andre, who was currently holding the cop by the wrist. Corelli was a survivor. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait to see if the cop was here for him or someone else. He immediately spun on his heel, his hand diving into the deep pocket of his coat. "Target is spooked. He's rabbiting." Harrison's voice exploded in Andre and Sarah's earpieces. "Take him down. Go, go, go." The operation was blown. The 8 months of waiting, the careful maneuvering, the aliases, all burned to the ground in an instant by Bradley Lawson's bloated ego. "Federal agents, freeze!" Sarah screamed, erupting from the booth with explosive speed. She vaulted over the table, entirely bypassing the struggling Lawson, her hand ripping a compact Glock 19 from a concealed holster beneath her oversized hoodie. Lawson yelped in sheer terror as the woman he had just been bullying produced a firearm with terrifying, practiced fluidity. At the counter, the illusion of the sleepy diner shattered completely. The 2 long-haul truckers, who had been quietly eating cold toast, suddenly moved. They weren't truckers. They were Corelli's buyers. "Feds!" The larger of the 2 truckers bellowed, flipping his heavy ceramic coffee mug straight at Betty's head to cause a distraction. The older woman screamed and dropped behind the counter. The trucker yanked a heavy, modified .45 caliber pistol from his waistband. Chaos descended like a falling guillotine. Andre shoved Lawson backward with enough force to send the heavy patrolman crashing into an adjacent table. Chairs splintered. Condiment bottles shattered in a spray of ketchup and broken glass. Andre drew his Sig Sauer P320 from his hip in a blur, leveling it at the armed trucker. "Drop the weapon," Andre roared, tracking the trucker. Gunfire erupted inside the diner. It was deafening, a physical pressure that punched at the eardrums. The trucker fired twice, wildly. One bullet shattered the neon clock above the kitchen door. The other ripped through the booth where Andre and Sarah had been sitting a second before, tearing a massive hole in the cheap vinyl. Andre didn't flinch. He returned fire. 2 suppressed, perfectly placed rounds that struck the trucker in the right shoulder and the thigh. The massive man crumpled to the floor with a howl of agony, his weapon sliding across the linoleum. By the door, Corelli was frantically trying to pull the door open, but he had drawn a compact submachine gun from his coat. He turned blindly, spraying a wild burst of automatic fire into the diner. Glass exploded. The pie display case disintegrated in a cloud of powdered sugar, cherry filling, and shrapnel. "Get down!" Sarah yelled, diving behind the reinforced steel counter next to a hyperventilating Betty. She popped out from the side, aiming down her sights. "Corelli, drop it!" Lawson, the self-proclaimed Lord of Oakridge, was nowhere to be seen in the fight. The man who had just threatened to drag them out by their hair was currently curled into a fetal position under the remains of a table, his hands clamped over his ears, sobbing uncontrollably. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He hadn't called for backup. He had completely mentally shattered the moment real violence entered his world. Corelli fired another burst, chewing up the wooden paneling near Andre's head. Andre dropped to a knee, sighted his weapon, and squeezed the trigger once. The bullet caught Corelli squarely in his shooting arm. The submachine gun dropped from his suddenly useless hand, clattering loudly against the floorboards. Corelli stumbled backward against the door, screaming in pain, clutching his bleeding bicep. The second trucker, the buyer's lookout, had taken one look at the speed and precision of Andre and Sarah, threw his hands in the air and dropped flat on his stomach, begging for his life. "Don't shoot! I surrender! I surrender!" Silence rushed back into the diner, ringing heavily in everyone's ears. The air was thick with the acrid, metallic smell of cordite and burned ozone. Rain continued to drum mercilessly against the single window that hadn't been shattered. "Clear?" Andre called out, keeping his weapon trained on Corelli, who was sliding down the doorframe, whimpering. "Clear!" Sarah yelled back, emerging from behind the counter. She kicked the downed trucker's weapon across the floor and quickly zip-tied his wrists behind his back. "Command, we have shots fired, suspects down, but secure. We need EMS for 2 gunshot wounds, non-fatal." Andre spoke clearly into the hidden mic on his lapel. "Copy that, Team 1. Breach teams are moving in now," Harrison replied. Seconds later, the parking lot was bathed in the blinding strobe of red and blue lights, but not from local cruisers. Massive, matte black tactical vehicles swarmed the lot. Heavily armored federal tactical operators poured out of the vans, breaching the diner through the front door and the rear kitchen entrance simultaneously. "Feds! Hands where I can see them!" Heavily armed men barked, flooding the room, instantly taking control of Corelli, the wounded buyer, and the lookout. Medics rushed in immediately after, applying tourniquets. Andre holstered his weapon and took a deep, steadying breath. He brushed a shard of shattered glass off his shoulder. He looked like a man who had just finished a mild workout, his heart rate already returning to baseline. He turned slowly, his eyes finding the whimpering, trembling mass of blue uniform huddled under the shattered table. Officer Bradley Lawson was covered in ketchup, spilled coffee, and his own cold sweat. His hat was gone, his radio was somewhere across the room, and his wide, terrified eyes were locked onto Andre. "You okay down there, officer?" Andre asked, his voice dripping with absolute, freezing contempt. The diner had been transformed from a sleepy roadside stop into a fully operational Federal Crime Scene Command post in less than 3 minutes. Floodlights were set up, evidence markers were being dropped like yellow confetti, and tactical operators secured a 2-block perimeter. The black leather briefcase Corelli had dropped was secured by a tech team. A quick scan revealed the heavily encrypted ledger they had been hunting for 8 months, along with $250,000 in banded hundreds. Captain Robert Harrison pushed his way through the shattered front doors. He was a tall, imposing man in a trench coat, wearing a gold FBI shield on a lanyard around his neck. His face was thunderous. He zeroed in on Andre and Sarah. "You two good?" "We're fine, Cap," Sarah said, wiping a streak of dust from her cheek. "Target secured. Ledger acquired. No civilian casualties. Betty in the back is shaken up, but unharmed." "Good work. Exceptional work, given the—" Harrison trailed off, his eyes shifting to the corner. 2 heavily armored Federal operators were currently pulling Officer Bradley Lawson out from under the broken table. The Oak Ridge patrolman was completely paralyzed by shock, his uniform stained and disheveled. He was breathing in short, ragged gasps. "Let go of me," Lawson weakly protested, trying to weakly shrug off the operators. I'm a police officer. I'm local PD. I need to report a shooting." "Sit him down," Harrison commanded. The operators roughly deposited Lawson into one of the intact booths. Andre and Sarah walked over, standing beside their captain. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently, so completely, that Lawson seemed to physically shrink under their gaze. Andre reached into the inner pocket of his ruined mechanic's jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. He flipped it open and tossed it onto the table in front of Lawson. It wasn't the fake Oregon ID. It was a solid gold, gleaming badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, seated next to a crisp credential card bearing his real name and rank. Sarah did the same, dropping her badge next to Andre's. "Special Agent Andre Miller, Task Force Lead," Andre said softly. "This is Special Agent Sarah Jenkins." Lawson stared at the badges. The gold shield seemed to burn into his retinas. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, chalky white. The people he had just threatened, belittled, and tried to unlawfully arrest were senior Federal agents. "You," Lawson stammered, his bravado entirely vanished. You were undercover." "We were executing a highly classified, multi-agency sting operation, targeting a violent interstate cartel," Captain Harrison barked, leaning over the table, placing both hands flat on the surface, just as Lawson had done to Andre 20 minutes earlier. "An operation that you, Officer Lawson, nearly destroyed with your arrogant, prejudiced, small-town power trip. I didn't know," Lawson pleaded, his voice cracking. He looked up at Andre, desperation in his eyes. "You looked suspicious. You were out-of-towners. I was just doing my job, doing community policing." "Community policing," Sarah snapped, her voice like cracking a whip. "You didn't ask the truckers for their IDs. You didn't ask Betty if there was a problem. You zeroed in on the only 2 black people in the diner, demanded our papers without reasonable suspicion, threatened us with physical violence, and attempted to unlawfully detain us. And when real danger showed up," Andre added coldly, gesturing to the bullet holes riddling the walls, "you hid under a table and cried while we protected the civilians you swore an oath to serve." Lawson shook his head furiously, tears of panic welling in his eyes. No, you don't understand. I have authority here. You didn't check in with local PD." "We didn't check in with local PD because we had credible intelligence that the cartel was paying off local deputies for safe routes," Harrison stated plainly. "And judging by your spectacular display of incompetence tonight, I'm glad we didn't." The front door opened again. a man in a sharp suit and a raincoat, looking furious and severely out of breath, stormed into the diner. It was Chief Thomas Weaver, the head of the Oak Ridge Police Department. "What the hell is going on here?" Weaver demanded, looking at the federal agents, the bullet holes, and finally, his patrolman sitting at the table, looking like a beaten dog. "Chief Weaver," Harrison said, stepping forward and flashing his credentials. "Captain Harrison, FBI. We just concluded a major narcotics and weapons bust, and we need to have a serious conversation about your officer." Weaver looked at Lawson, his face contorting with a mix of anger and dread. "Lawson, what did you do?" "Chief, I was just doing a patrol check. These guys wouldn't comply," Lawson cried, pointing a shaking finger at Andre. "They were resisting. I was trying to maintain order." "Everything is recorded, Chief," Andre said, tapping the collar of his jacket. "High-definition audio wire. We have his entire racist diatribe, his illegal commands, and his threats of violence perfectly preserved on federal servers. We also have camera footage from our surveillance vans, showing his vehicle parked out front, completely blowing our covert posture." Chief Weaver closed his eyes, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He knew Lawson. He knew the complaints that had quietly piled up against him over the years. Complaints from minorities, from out-of-towners, from teenagers. Complaints that had been swept under the rug because Lawson was the nephew of a county judge. But you couldn't sweep the FBI under the rug. "Lawson," Weaver said, his voice deadly quiet. "Stand up." Lawson shakily got to his feet, leaning heavily against the table. "Chief, please. I've got 20 years on the force." "And as of right now, you don't have 21, Weaver said coldly. "Hand over your weapon and your badge." "Badge? What? Chief, you can't do this. The Union—" "The Union isn't going to touch this with a 10-foot pole once the Bureau hands over the audio of you trying to illegally assault 2 federal agents during a cartel sting," Weaver roared, his temper finally snapping. "You embarrassed this department. You endangered a federal operation, and you proved every worst stereotype about small-town cops. Give me your weapon right now, or I'll have these federal officers arrest you for obstruction of justice." Trembling violently, sobbing openly now, Lawson unbuckled his heavy gun belt. It hit the floor with a dull, pathetic thud. He unpinned the silver star from his chest, his hand shaking so badly he pricked his own finger, leaving a tiny drop of blood on the cheap fabric of his shirt. He handed the badge to Chief Weaver. "You're suspended indefinitely, pending an internal affairs tribunal and a federal review of your conduct," Weaver said, pocketing the badge. "Get out of my sight. Walk home." Lawson looked around the diner. The federal operators were ignoring him. Betty wouldn't look at him. Corelli, bleeding on a stretcher, sneered at him as medics wheeled him out. He turned back to Andre and Sarah, a broken, hollow shell of the bully who had walked in 30 minutes prior. "You're lucky, Lawson," Andre said, leaning in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you had actually drawn your weapon when you grabbed me, I would have put 2 in your chest, and I would have slept just fine tonight. Walk out that door and don't ever put on a uniform again." Lawson turned, a pathetic, rain-soaked figure in a disarmed uniform, and walked out of Rusty's diner into the pouring rain. He had no cruiser. He had no badge. He had no power. The door swung shut behind him, the cheerful little bell chiming one last time. "Coffee's cold," Sarah noted. Looking at their shattered booth, Andre actually smiled. "I think we've earned something a little stronger, partner." The walk home took Bradley Lawson 45 minutes. It was 3 miles of cracked asphalt and relentless, freezing rain. Cars drove past him, their headlights cutting through the deluge, splashing dirty water against his trousers. No one stopped. The Oak Ridge cruiser that usually shielded him from the elements, The metal box from which he judged and terrorized his neighbors was gone. He walked through his front door shivering, soaked to the bone, leaving muddy footprints on the pristine hardwood floor of the suburban home, his police salary, and a few under-the-table gifts from local businesses he promised to protect, had paid for. His wife, Brenda, came down the stairs in her silk robe, a scowl forming on her face. "Bradley, look at the floor. Where is your cruiser? Where is your gun?" Lawson didn't answer. He walked past her, his eyes hollow, and collapsed into his leather recliner, still wearing his wet clothes. The gravity of what had just happened was finally settling into his bones. He hadn't just messed up a traffic stop. He had physically assaulted a federal agent during a high-stakes undercover operation. The audio tape was in the hands of the FBI. He was ruined. By 8 a.m. the next morning, Oak Ridge was no longer a sleepy town. It was the epicenter of a massive federal earthquake. When Chief Thomas Weaver arrived at the precinct, he found the parking lot filled with black Suburbans. Inside, the station had been completely taken over by federal agents wearing windbreakers with bold yellow letters, FBI and OIG, Office of the Inspector General. Leading the charge was Special Agent Thomas Reynolds, a ruthless, methodical investigator from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Reynolds didn't care about town politics or who Lawson's relatives were. He cared about paper trails and federal statutes. "Chief Weaver," Reynolds said, not offering his hand as Weaver stepped into his own bullpen. "We are seizing the internal affairs records, dash-cam footage, and arrest reports for Officer Bradley Lawson for the past 10 years. We have the federal warrant signed by a district judge." 10 years? Weaver swallowed hard. "Agent Reynolds, Lawson is suspended. I took his badge last night. We're handling this internally." "You lost the right to handle it internally the moment your officer laid hands on a federal task force lead," Reynolds replied coldly, handing Weaver the warrant. "Furthermore, preliminary reviews of Lawson's file show 23 civilian complaints for excessive force, racial profiling, and unlawful detention. All 23 were dismissed by this department without penalty. This isn't just about last night, Chief. This is about a pattern and practice of civil rights violations under the color of law. We are tearing this precinct down to the studs." In his living room, a desperate Lawson was pacing. He had dialed the number for his uncle, County Judge Arthur Pendleton, 6 times. On the 7th ring, the judge finally answered. "Uncle Artie," Lawson breathed, his voice cracking with panic. "Thank God. Listen, you have to help me. It was a misunderstanding. They set me up at the diner last night. The FBI, they—" "Stop talking, Bradley." Judge Pendleton's voice was like ice. There was no familial warmth, only the cold calculation of a politician realizing he was standing next to a lightning rod. "Do not say another word on an unsecured line." "Artie, they took my badge. Weaver left me out to dry." "You left yourself out to dry, you arrogant fool," the judge hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I just got a call from the district attorney. The FBI is pulling every conviction you were ever the primary arresting officer on. They're looking at federal civil rights charges, deprivation of rights under color of law. But you can talk to the DA, right? You can smooth this over. We're family." "There is no smoothing over the FBI, Bradley," the judge shouted, his temper flaring. "You threatened a black federal agent, demanded ID without cause, and attempted to violently detain him, all while his wire was recording your racist garbage. The Department of Justice is making an example out of you, and I will not let you drag my chambers down with your sinking ship. Do not call this number again. Hire a defense attorney. A good one. You're going to need it." The line went dead. Lawson stared at the phone. The safety net he had relied on his entire life, the good old boy network of Oak Ridge County, had just completely vaporized. Over the next 3 weeks, the nightmare only intensified. Agent Reynolds and his team were meticulous. They recovered lost dashcam footages from Lawson's cruiser. The videos painted a horrifying picture. They showed Lawson pulling over minority drivers for failing to signal, dragging them out of their cars, tearing apart their vehicles without probable cause, and leaving them humiliated on the side of the highway. They found the text messages, group chats with other deputies where Lawson used horrific slurs and bragged about how he controlled the town. The story leaked to the press. It wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was a national headline. Rogue cop derails cartel bust. FBI uncovers decades of abuse. News vans parked outside Lawson's house. Protesters gathered on his lawn, holding signs demanding justice for the dozens of lives he had ruined over his 20-year career. Brenda couldn't take the pressure. The whispered insults at the grocery store, the vandalized mailbox, the freezing of their joint bank accounts due to pending civil litigation. One afternoon, while Lawson was meeting with a desperately expensive defense attorney he could barely afford, Brenda packed her bags. When Lawson returned, he found the house empty, save for a note on the kitchen counter. "I can't live like this, Bradley. Don't try to find me." He was utterly alone. The badge that had once made him feel like a god was gone, leaving behind only a pathetic, terrified man who was finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. 9 months later, the fallout of the Rusty's Diner incident reached its climax in 2 separate federal courtrooms. In the primary courtroom, the United States government delivered a fatal blow to the Corelli syndicate. Because of the ledger Andre and Sarah successfully secured before all hell broke loose, the DEA and ATF executed coordinated, simultaneous raids on 14 stash houses across 3 states. They seized over 200 ghost guns, 40 pounds of pure fentanyl, and $20 million in illicit cash. Dominic Corelli, his right arm still in a sling from the bullet Andre had put in his bicep, took a plea deal to avoid life without parole. He turned state's evidence, ratting out the cartel bosses in exchange for a 25-year sentence. Andre Miller and Sarah Jenkins were awarded the Director's Medal for bravery. Their faces never made the news, their identities remained classified, but within the intelligence community they were legends. They had stared down a corrupt cop, a cartel hitman, and a heavily armed crew without blinking. But it was in a smaller, quieter courtroom, on the 4th floor of the federal courthouse, where the real karma was served. The trial of the United States versus Bradley Lawson was a swift and brutal affair. Lawson sat at the defense table, wearing an ill-fitting grey suit. He had aged 10 years in 9 months. His hair was completely white, his skin deeply lined, and he possessed a constant nervous tremor in his hands. He looked nothing like the hulking bully who had swaggered into the diner. The prosecution, led by a razor-sharp federal litigator named Assistant U.S. Attorney David Carmichael, systematically dismantled Lawson's life. They called the victims of Lawson's past traffic stops, men and women who wept on the stand as they recounted being terrified for their lives, humiliated on the side of the road by a man who wore a badge to mask his bigotry. Then came the centerpiece of the trial. Andre Miller, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, took the stand. He projected an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. Carmichael walked him through the events of that rainy Tuesday night. "Agent Miller," Carmichael asked, pacing before the jury box, "did you or Agent Jenkins give Officer Lawson any reason to suspect you were committing a crime?" "No, sir," Andre replied, his voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "We were drinking coffee, waiting for our target. We were compliant, polite, and de-escalating at every turn." "And yet, he demanded your identification?" "He did. Under threat of violence." Carmichael turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to play Exhibit C, the audio recording from Agent Miller's wire." Lawson closed his eyes. his hands gripping the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew what was coming. The audio filled the courtroom. The jury heard the rain. They heard the clinking of coffee cups. And then they heard Lawson. "Just doing a little neighborhood watch, pal. You folks aren't from around here, are you?" They heard the dripping contempt, the thinly veiled threats. They heard Sarah calmly quoting the law and Lawson's explosive, violent reaction. "I don't like your attitude. I don't like your tone. And I sure as hell don't want your kind bringing down the property value of my town. That's it. You're both under arrest for trespassing and resisting. Stand the hell up." The audio cut off with the sound of scuffling chairs and Lawson's panicked yelp as Andre disarmed his aggression. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The jury, a diverse cross-section of the state, stared at Lawson with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Lawson's defense attorney tried to argue that it was a simple misunderstanding, that Lawson was acting on heightened alert due to recent burglaries, but Carmichael destroyed the argument on cross-examination. He pointed out that Lawson had ignored two white truckers sitting 10 feet away, zeroing in exclusively on the only black couple in the room. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, Lawson couldn't even look up. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of obstruction of a federal investigation, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. 2 weeks later, Lawson stood before federal judge William H. Harrison for sentencing. "Mr. Lawson," the judge said, peering down at him over his reading glasses, "the power granted to law enforcement is a sacred trust. It is given with the understanding that it will be used to protect the vulnerable, not to terrorize them. You used your badge as a weapon of prejudice. You used it to bully, to intimidate, and to fulfill your own pathetic need for dominance. In doing so, you not only destroyed the lives of innocent civilians, but you jeopardized the lives of federal agents working to keep this country safe." Lawson openly wept, the tears tracking through the deep wrinkles of his face. "Your Honor, I'm sorry. I lost everything. My wife, my house, my pension. Please." "You lost the things you did not deserve to keep," the judge replied coldly. "This court will not show you the leniency you denied your victims." Judge Harrison sentenced Bradley Lawson to 14 years in federal prison. Because Lawson was a former law enforcement officer convicted of civil rights violations, he could not be placed in the general population. He was sent to a maximum security federal penitentiary in the Midwest, placed in a segregated housing unit. His days were spent in a concrete cell, isolated, 23 hours a day. The remaining hour of recreation was spent in a wire cage alone. The town of Oak Ridge was forced into a massive consent decree by the Department of Justice. The police department was overhauled, fitted with mandatory body cameras, and placed under strict federal oversight. Chief Weaver was forced into early retirement. The civil lawsuits from Lawson's past victims completely bankrupted him. The state revoked his pension. Every dollar he had ever earned while hiding behind that badge was taken from him and given to the people he had hurt. The system he had manipulated for 20 years had finally turned its unblinking, heavy eye onto him. 1,000 miles away, in a bustling diner in downtown Chicago, the neon sign flickered gently against the night window. The rain was coming down hard, splashing against the pavement. Andre Miller and Sarah Jenkins sat in a corner booth. They weren't wearing mechanics' jackets or worn hoodies today. They were dressed sharply, looking over a thick file dossier, labeled with top-secret clearance stickers. A young waitress walked over, pouring 2 fresh cups of black coffee. "Can I get you folks anything else?" she asked with a warm smile. "We're good, thank you," Andre said politely, offering a genuine smile in return. "You guys working late?" she asked, noticing the thick files. "Something like that," Sarah replied, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "Just trying to clean up the streets a little." The waitress nodded, walking back to the counter. Andre closed the file, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the manila cover. He looked out the window, watching the city lights blur in the rain. "You ever think about him?" Sarah asked, quietly, not needing to say the name. Andre paused. He thought about the rusty diner in Oak Ridge. He thought about the heavy hand on his shoulder, the venom in the cop's voice, and the absolute terror in Lawson's eyes when the gold federal badge hit the table. "No," Andre said simply, his voice calm and steady. "I don't think about him at all. Men like him think they are the main character of the world. They think their power is absolute. But the truth is, they're just a speck of dirt on the windshield of justice." Sarah smiled, raising her coffee mug slightly. "To wiping the windshield." Andre clinked his mug against hers. "To wiping the windshield." They turned back to their files. There was another cartel, another kingpin, another shadow hiding in the dark. The work never stopped, but as they sat in the warm light of the diner, they knew that somewhere in a cold, concrete cell, a bully who thought he was a god was finally learning what real justice felt like. True justice isn't always swift, but when it arrives, it hits with the unstoppable force of a freight train. Officer Lawson thought his badge gave him the right to act like a tyrant, but he forgot that the law applies to everyone, especially those sworn to uphold it. Sometimes karma wears a federal badge. If this story of intense karma and real-world justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a satisfying plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, dramatic stories. Until next time, stay safe and stay sharp.